What if the person you think you are in love with does not actually exist? Not literally, of course. She is real. She has a name, a voice, a laugh you would recognize in a crowded room. But the version of her you carry around in your mind, the one you defend to your friends, the one you make excuses for, the one you lie awake thinking about, that version might be something you built yourself, brick by brick, out of hope and fear and a desperate need for the story to work out. And if that is true, then the heartbreak you have felt or the heartbreak you are bracing yourself for right now was never really about her at all. This is uncomfortable in a way most relationship advice never dares to be. It is going to challenge something you have probably never questioned. The assumption that falling in love is a pure, spontaneous, almost sacred event that happens to you rather than something engineered by forces far older and far less romantic than you would like to believe. There is a way of thinking about love, one that stretches back through centuries of philosophy, that treats romantic passion not as poetry, but as machinery, not as destiny, but as a mechanism. According to this view, what we call falling in love is not really about the specific person in front of us at all. It is a kind of trick, a beautifully disguised biological imperative that exists for one purpose only, to keep the species continuing, to push two people together long enough to produce another generation, and then to quietly step back once its job is done. Underneath every trembling hand, every racing heart, every sleepless night spent replaying a single conversation, there is an ancient, indifferent system running in the background, one that does not actually care whether you are happy. It only cares whether you reproduce. That sounds cold, almost insulting to every feeling you have ever had. But sit with it for a moment before you dismiss it, because there is something underneath this bleak idea that might actually set you free. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. If falling in love is, at least in part, a mechanism rather than a pure meeting of souls, then the person you fell for was never fully in your control. And more importantly, the person you fell for was never fully who you thought they were either. What you actually fell for was an image, a composite, a private sculpture assembled out of small real details and enormous imagined ones, polished and displayed in the gallery of your own mind until it looked less like a human being and more like a solution to everything that had ever felt missing in your life. This is the quiet machinery of idealization, and almost nobody escapes it completely. You meet someone, she laughs at your joke, and in that laugh you hear more than amusement. You hear understanding, chemistry, maybe even destiny. She mentions she loves the same obscure film you do, and suddenly it is not coincidence anymore. It is proof that the universe has been arranging this moment all along. Every small compatible detail gets magnified, and every incompatible one gets quietly filed away, excused, minimized, because the story you are building does not have room for inconvenient details yet. Not this early. Not while the fantasy is still under construction. And here is the part that turns this from an interesting idea into something genuinely dangerous. The real person, the actual human being underneath the fantasy, will eventually fail to match the sculpture you built of her. She has bad days. She says something careless. She reveals a flaw you had not accounted for, a habit that grates, a boundary that does not bend the way you assumed it would. And in that moment, something inside you does not just register a disappointing fact about another person, it registers something closer to grief. Because part of what is dying in that moment is the fantasy itself. The private masterpiece you spent months or years constructing, quietly crumbling in real time. Most people mistake that grief for heartbreak over losing her. But look closer and you will notice something stranger happening underneath it. A significant portion of that pain is not about her at all. It is about losing the story. It is about mourning the version of your own future that the fantasy promised you, the completed, secure, finally satisfied version of yourself that you believed would exist once this relationship worked the way you needed it to. Let that sink in for a moment, because it is the hinge this entire conversation turns on. If a large portion of romantic suffering is actually grief for a fantasy rather than grief for a person, then chasing the next relationship to fix that pain is like trying to cure a hallucination by finding a better hallucination. It does not address anything. It just resets the clock on the same collapse, waiting patiently to happen again. Now, here is where this gets even more uncomfortable, because I am not just talking about how love begins. I am talking about what happens after once two people are actually together, once the initial fantasy starts negotiating with reality on a daily basis. Because there is a particular kind of collapse that happens to men specifically, and it is rarely discussed honestly, mostly because admitting to it feels like admitting weakness. It goes something like this. A man meets someone he is genuinely drawn to. At first, everything about the connection feels electric, effortless, mutual. But somewhere in the following months, without ever consciously deciding to, he starts orienting his entire emotional world around her. Her mood becomes the barometer for his day. Her attention becomes the currency his self-worth is priced in. Her approval starts functioning less like a nice bonus and more like oxygen, something he did not realize he had become dependent on until the supply started feeling unreliable. He tells himself this is devotion. He tells himself this is what real love looks like: total, consuming, unconditional. He will say things like, "I would do anything for her. I give her everything I have," as though the size of the sacrifice is proof of the depth of the feeling. But here is the uncomfortable question almost nobody asks in that moment. Is that devotion, or is it dependency wearing devotion's clothing? Because there is a version of giving everything that comes from abundance, from a man so secure in himself that generosity flows outward naturally without keeping score. And there is another version of giving everything that comes from scarcity, from a quiet, unspoken terror that if he stops giving, stops performing, stops proving his worth through constant sacrifice, the whole relationship will collapse and take his sense of self down with it. From the outside, these two versions can look almost identical. Both involve a man doing a lot for the woman he loves, but underneath they are opposites, and the difference between them determines almost everything about how the relationship will eventually unfold. Here is a question worth sitting with, honestly, even if the answer stings a little. When you say, "I do everything for you," is there a quiet, unspoken expectation hiding inside that sentence? An assumption that this sacrifice is owed something in return, that enough devotion will eventually guarantee security, guarantee loyalty, guarantee that she will never leave. If so, that sentence was never actually about generosity. It was a transaction disguised as selflessness. And transactions dressed up as sacrifice tend to curdle into resentment the moment the expected payment does not arrive on schedule. This is where the fantasy of unconditional love starts to reveal its hidden cost, because true unconditional giving asks for nothing in return, not even security. The moment you need something back, even something as reasonable sounding as commitment or reassurance, you have quietly exited the territory of love and entered the territory of negotiation. Except only one side of the negotiation was ever spoken out loud. Let us talk about what this actually does to a man over time, because the damage does not announce itself all at once. It accumulates quietly, almost invisibly, the way rust accumulates on something left out in the rain. A man who has organized his emotional stability entirely around another person's responses starts without noticing to shrink. His opinions soften into whatever keeps the peace. His plans start bending around her schedule. His friendships, the ones that used to anchor him outside the relationship, start quietly fading. Not because she demanded it necessarily, but because there simply is not enough of him left over once the relationship has absorbed most of his attention. And here is the part that should genuinely alarm you if you recognize any of it in yourself. The less of himself a man has remaining outside the relationship, the less interesting, less magnetic, and paradoxically less lovable he tends to become to the very person he is trying so hard to keep. Nobody actually finds constant availability, constant accommodation, and constant emotional dependency attractive for very long, no matter how much comfort those things might offer in a single difficult moment. What sustains genuine respect over time is not sacrifice, it is substance. A person with direction, with boundaries, with something in their life besides the relationship itself is simply harder to stop noticing than someone who has quietly disappeared into being available. This is the part of the conversation that almost nobody wants to hear because it sounds almost cruel at first. Loving someone completely in the sense of erasing yourself for their comfort does not protect a relationship. It slowly poisons it. Not because the other person is cruel or ungrateful, but because respect requires two whole people standing across from each other. And it is very difficult to respect in the deepest sense someone who has stopped standing on their own. Here is a thought experiment that tends to land hard once you actually sit with it. Imagine watching someone else, a friend, a brother, someone you care about, slowly disappear into a relationship exactly the way you might be doing right now. Imagine watching him cancel plans with people who have known him for decades because she seemed a little annoyed about it. Imagine watching him abandon a goal he had been chasing for years because pursuing it required time she did not want to give up. Would you call that love? Or would some part of you quietly worry that he was losing himself? Most people can see that pattern clearly in someone else's life within seconds. It is far harder to see it in your own because from the inside, self-erasure often feels like commitment. It feels noble. It feels like proof that you are capable of real, deep, selfless love, when in reality, it might be the exact opposite. A symptom of a man who has quietly outsourced his sense of worth to someone else's opinion of him because building that worth internally always felt too uncertain, too slow, too unguaranteed. Let us go somewhere even more uncomfortable because this next part explains why the fear underneath all of this rarely gets named honestly. At the root of most emotional dependency is not love, it is fear. Specifically, it is the fear of being alone with yourself, unfiltered, unaccompanied, forced to sit with whatever silence and self-examination that solitude demands. For a lot of men, romantic attachment becomes less about the specific woman and more about avoiding a confrontation with something older and more uncomfortable, an unresolved question about their own worth that has been sitting there quietly since long before this relationship ever began. If that is true, and for a great many people it is, then no amount of devotion, no quantity of sacrifice, no perfect partner will ever actually resolve the underlying fear, because the fear was never really about being single in the first place. It was about being alone with an internal voice that has never been given the attention it needed. A relationship built on top of that unresolved fear does not heal it. It simply muffles it temporarily, the way turning up music can drown out a conversation you do not want to have right up until the music stops. Here is where this conversation takes a turn that might surprise you because so far it sounded almost entirely bleak. And that is not actually where this is heading because underneath this uncomfortable diagnosis is something closer to liberation than despair if you are willing to sit with it long enough to reach the other side. If falling in love is partly mechanism, partly fantasy, partly the mind painting a masterpiece over an ordinary human being, then the pressure to find the one perfect person who will complete you, save you, or finally make you feel whole starts to dissolve. Because that person was never going to exist in the first place. Not because love is not real, but because completion was never something another person could actually provide. It was always something that had to be built from the inside, brick by brick, the exact same way the fantasy itself was built, except this time out of something sturdier than projection and hope. This is where the conversation shifts from heartbreak to strategy, from diagnosis to direction. Because once you understand that emotional dependency is the disease, the antidote is not finding a better, more reliable person to depend on. The antidote is becoming someone who no longer needs to. Let us talk about what that actually looks like in practice, because abstract philosophy is worthless if it does not translate into something a person can actually live by. It starts with identity. Specifically, the parts of your identity that exist completely independent of whether anyone is watching, approving, or even present. What did you care about before this relationship began? What ambitions quietly got shelved somewhere along the way? Not because you lost interest in them, but because pursuing them started to feel like a distraction from keeping the peace at home. Reclaiming those threads is not selfish. It is structural. A man with a direction of his own, projects that matter to him regardless of anyone's opinion, friendships that exist entirely outside the relationship, becomes someone whose stability does not rise and fall with someone else's mood. And that stability is not a side effect of attraction. It is very often the actual source of it. Here is something worth genuinely sitting with because it inverts almost everything modern romantic culture teaches. We are taught that constant closeness proves love. That texting first, texting often, always being available, always prioritizing the relationship above everything else is the highest expression of devotion. But respect. The kind that sustains long-term desire rather than short-term comfort rarely grows out of constant availability. It grows out of consistency, reliability, and the quiet, undeniable evidence that a person's word and actions align. A man who says he values his own goals, but abandons them the moment they inconvenience someone else, has just taught the people around him, consciously or not, exactly how much his own word is worth. This is where boundaries stop being a defensive tactic and start being something closer to a form of honesty. A boundary is not a wall built to keep someone out. It is a statement of fact about who you actually are and what you are actually willing to accept, spoken plainly instead of hoped for silently. The absence of boundaries does not create more love. It creates confusion because nobody can genuinely respect a person whose limits keep dissolving under enough pressure, no matter how kindly that dissolving is disguised as flexibility. Let us return to that idea of the sculpture for a moment, because there is a second sculpture hiding in this entire story that almost nobody notices until it is pointed out directly. It is not only the other person who gets idealized in the early stages of infatuation. You do too in your own mind, as the version of yourself you believe you need to become in order to be worthy of her attention. That idealized self is often quieter than you actually are, more agreeable than you actually are, more endlessly patient than you actually are. Because somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that the real, unfiltered version of you might not be enough to keep her interested. And so you started performing a slightly edited version of yourself, one small compromise at a time, each one so minor it barely registered, until eventually the person she thinks she is in a relationship with is someone slightly different from the person you actually are underneath all that careful editing. That gap between your performed self and your actual self is exhausting to maintain indefinitely, and worse, it is fragile. It requires constant vigilance, constant management, constant fear of the mask slipping. And ironically, the moment it does slip, the moment the real, unfiltered, occasionally difficult version of you finally shows up, it often lands as a betrayal rather than an honest revelation, because the other person fell for the performance, not the person underneath it. This is precisely why building genuine self-respect matters so much more than most relationship advice acknowledges. Self-respect is not about arrogance or emotional coldness. It is about closing that gap between who you present and who you actually are until there is nothing left to maintain, nothing left to perform, nothing left to fear being discovered. A man operating from that place does not need reassurance the way a man performing a role does, because there is no mask left that could ever be pulled off to reveal something he was hiding. Here is a question worth asking yourself honestly right now, without softening the answer to make yourself feel better. If your partner disappeared from your life tomorrow, not through any fault of yours, simply gone, would the person left behind still recognize himself? Would his goals still exist? Would his friendships still be intact? Would his sense of worth still be standing? Or would it have quietly walked out the door alongside her? For a lot of men, the honest answer to that question is more unsettling than they would like to admit. And that discomfort is worth sitting with rather than rushing past, because it is pointing directly at the exact place where the real work needs to happen. Let us talk about what a healthier version of this actually looks like, because tearing something down without offering a replacement is only half a conversation. A relationship built on two complete autonomous people rather than two halves desperately searching for completion functions completely differently under pressure. Disagreements do not feel like existential threats because neither person's entire identity is hanging on the outcome. Time apart does not feel like abandonment because both people have lives substantial enough to fill that time meaningfully. And attraction, instead of running on the manufactured urgency of scarcity and fear, runs on something far more durable. Ongoing admiration for a person who continues to grow, continues to pursue something, continues to be someone worth choosing again and again rather than someone simply being tolerated out of habit or fear of starting over. That distinction, being chosen versus being tolerated, might be the most important one in this entire conversation, because most people can sense the difference intuitively, even when they cannot articulate it. Being tolerated feels like walking on ice, constantly monitoring the temperature of the relationship, constantly adjusting your behavior to avoid the crack forming beneath your feet. Being chosen feels stable, not because nothing could ever go wrong, but because both people are standing there by genuine preference rather than desperate necessity. and desperate necessity is exhausting to sustain for either party over the long run. Here is where this conversation has to get personal, because philosophy without application is just an interesting way to pass the time. If you have recognized yourself anywhere in what has been described here, the disappearing friendships, the shelved ambitions, the quiet performance replacing the real version of you, the good news is that none of it is permanent. Identity that has been buried is not identity that has been destroyed. It is identity waiting for enough attention to resurface. The starting point is not a grand gesture. It is smaller and far less romantic sounding than that. It is rebuilding a single habit, a single friendship, a single ambition that exists entirely for its own sake, with no audience required, no approval necessary, no relationship status attached to whether it succeeds or fails. It is asking yourself before asking whether she is satisfied with you, whether you are satisfied with how you are actually living, not how the relationship is going, how you specifically, independent of anyone else's opinion, are actually conducting yourself day to day. Because here is the quiet, uncomfortable truth. This entire journey has been circling around from the very beginning. Nobody can genuinely respect a person who has stopped respecting himself first. Not because respect is some prize to be earned through performance, but because respect, real respect, is contagious in a very specific direction. It flows outward from a stable internal source, and it is almost impossible to fake convincingly for very long once that internal source runs dry. So let us return to the question we opened with, because it should feel different now than it did a few minutes ago. What if the person you think you are in love with does not actually exist? What if the version you have been chasing, defending, sacrificing yourself for was assembled by your own mind out of hope, projection, and fear of being alone with yourself? That question is not meant to destroy your capacity for love. It is meant to redirect it away from a fantasy that was always going to disappoint you eventually and towards something far more solid. A version of love that starts with two whole people, not two people desperately hoping the other one will finally make them feel complete. If something in what you just heard hit closer to home than you expected, whether it is a relationship you are currently in, one you are still healing from, or simply a pattern you are finally seeing clearly for the first time, take a moment to acknowledge that. Because the first step toward change is not action, it is awareness. And awareness, once it arrives, has a way of refusing to leave. If this reached something in you, subscribe, because there is a lot more of this kind of honest, uncomfortable conversation ahead. The kind most people are too afraid to have out loud. And if you know someone quietly disappearing into a relationship the way we have just described, someone giving everything and slowly losing themselves in the process, send this to him. Sometimes the most loving thing you can hand another person is not advice. It is permission to finally stop erasing himself in order to be loved.